introduce Rick Klein.
Hi.
Good evening, everyone. Let's give it up again for John Dorsey. What a great presentation.
Thank you.
Please,
Really quick.
go ahead.
So obviously I want to thank John Dahl, Libby Geist, Jenna at ESPN. They were and have been so supportive for me as a filmmaker. This is the third project that I've done with them, and each one gets more and more rewarding. And the landscape of everything that we do in this business is the better for what they've done at 30 for 30. And I also wanted to acknowledge a couple of people who were instrumental in making it on my side of things. Andrew Stefan, who's my best friend and business partner, and it was actually his idea to do a story about replacement players. And we huddled up and we figured out real quick it needed to be about the Redskins. And then I also wanted to acknowledge a guy named Brian Giberson, who was a terrific editor, and that archival that's so brilliantly deployed in this film wouldn't have sung the way that it does without his handiwork. And then, I don't know, Malcolm, are you here? Malcolm, you want to raise your hand, buddy? Okay, so the director of photography, one of the two, this film was so big and sprawling that we had two DPs, and one of them is a hometown boy from DC, Malcolm Surratt. You want to stand up and... Really beautiful work. So yeah.
Well, congratulations on the film. It's a remarkable piece of storytelling and a great Washington story today for our audience. But so you come at this, and the idea of making something about the replacement players, about this extraordinary couple of weeks in NFL history that became such a big deal at the time. But you settle on Washington, but there's a lot of the story that I imagine you don't know at the time. What did you learn through the process of making this film? What surprised you as a filmmaker and as a sports fan about this story?
Well, I knew that the strike season of 1987 ended up, in a Super Bowl victory. So instantly, that galvanizes your attention when you start to try and pick out, okay, well, who did the strike work out well for? But then when you start to dig into it a little deeper, and you see, the thing about it that's really interesting to me is, like, we, amongst our little core group, we like to say that these guys thought that they were getting the golden ticket, and that they ended up getting the scarlet letter. Because this experience that should be something that they brag about at cocktail parties or whatever, they've been conditioned by life not to bring it up. Because as soon as they do, someone's quick to diminish the experience and say, oh, well, you're just a scab. Not really realizing, as I didn't really realize, that they were tackling a first ballot Hall of Famer in Tony Dorsett. They were blocking a first ballot Hall of Famer in Randy White, that they had faced legitimate NFL talent by the end of that strike in a very real way. And so that seemed sad, that they were living with that burden, and that it was kind of, the other thing we say is that it was the scab that wouldn't heal, and to see how that manifests itself, how that pain kind of manifests itself in different ways for different guys, but some more acute than others, made me, when you're spending time with them, you really begin to root for them and empathize with them. And if we were able to communicate just a portion of what we were feeling through the film, then we succeeded, because I felt like there was a right that needed to be wronged here, and at the very least, we needed to give them their moment in the sun. And so one of the things, can I say, that became super cool about it in the making was the realization that these guys are walking among us. You don't know, I think I might have just said this, but you don't know that your stockbroker or your cellmate or your kid's high school football coach or whatever had this experience, like I say, because they don't like to bring it up. And tonight, a few of them are walking among us tonight. And so, I want to get emotional. So, if I'd like to call a couple of their names one last time here in DC, so just forgive me if I'm going to refer to a couple notes here real quick. I don't want to get this stuff wrong. At linebacker, From Jackson State, number 58, David Wyndham, will you please stand up? At linebacker again from Elon, number 91, Tony Settles. And at wide receiver from the University of Washington, number 89, and still the Washington Redskins all-time single-game receiving record holder, Anthony Allen, please.
That's cool. And a great Washington reception. And I wanted to talk about the Washington of it because it struck me. I've lived here for about a dozen years, and one of the first things I learned when I lived here is that people are from everywhere in Washington, D.C., but it always seemed that the one thing that united this town more than anything else was the Washington Redskins. And even through some lean years recently, you go a Sunday, you can get a lot of grocery shopping done because there's no one out during the middle of the Redskins game. Is there something about Washington that worked for this team and that this team worked for? The fan base, the fact that the shots of the Capitol throughout, this is the seat of power, the seat of government, but it's also a community. People who cut across demographic lines, who root for this team. Is there something about this city that was particular to this story that it wouldn't have worked somewhere else?
Well, I will say this. You saw in the film, and everyone here probably knows, especially in that golden era, the demand for tickets was extraordinary. There was a wait list. I mean, I think it was exaggerated by a fan in the film, but it was, dozens of years, the wait list to get season tickets. And when tickets, what that meant was that there was this giant pent-up, latent demand for fans to experience, so what you had, in a sense, was almost when some fans decided to turn their tickets in, you had Scab fans, kind of, people who had the opportunity to go to a game for the first time because tickets were actually available, and be a part of, the experience at RFK for in many cases the first time. I think that kind of juiced what was there already, which was this sense that, and there's bubbling underneath the surface, fans were just waiting for an excuse to root for these guys. I think they just needed to do well, right? Because the minute that you started to see these guys perform at a high level, then something about like a vicarious sense of projection and identification starts to happen. Like, oh, that could be me. Like, that guy was working where last week? That could be me. I mean, and then there was this, so there was already this kind of built into the DNA of the situation, the possibility of a real rooting or interest taking hold. And I think that was there in every market, but in DC in particular, the fact that fans were able to kind of join in the experience for the first time was unique.
And it seems like the Joe Gibbs philosophy is important in this, and I think the way you play Gibbs versus Tex Schramm, the two different approaches of the different franchises, I think is an effective way to tell a story. I also think, it struck me in watching it, they both wanted to win, right? They knew these games counted. They had different theories, different philosophies about the importance of team and wanting to have your stars out there and what would ultimately work. But it felt to me that Joe Gibbs had a philosophy here. That he went into this and said, I'm dealt this hand, I'm going to do with it what I can, and this is how I'm going to play it out. And that philosophy didn't change even though the players did.
Well, sports are about heart, and this film, I think, hopefully by, just by accident, by design, or by accident rather, that these guys shared their story with us. the film has some heart because these guys had a lot of heart, and I think that what was good, what was decisive in terms of how the two teams succeeded or failed during the strike was that what Dallas did was cynical. And the audience may find this of interest. I'm from Dallas. I grew up in Dallas.
Oh boy.
And I was actually at that game. I was 16 years old. I was actually at that Monday night game because I could get a ticket for the first time. And in Dallas, I think the fans were ready to turn the page from the old guard, and the team was already aging and on the decline, while Washington was definitely in the throes of their golden era. And so at the beginning of that strike, fans really were starting to embrace their replacements there. So when, and fans had a sense like, wait a minute, Tony Dorsett was on the picket line and now he's crossing, what's going on? Why did he change? What's the change of heart? Something smelled fishy about the whole thing. And it was ultimately a cynical ploy to game the strike for the team's advantage. And I think that the fact that that cynicism backfired was poetic justice, and it was really, as they say, the beginning of the end for that era of the Cowboys.
So in the storytelling, the cynicism backfires because the Cowboys lose. You fast forward though 30 years, and the NFL has had an amazing run. This was a successful league 30 years ago, and now it is mega at another level of everything. Yeah. And it strikes me that if there hadn't been the hard line taken to end the labor woes at the time, a lot of decisions that follow don't happen. And this has been a great time for the NFL. Do you see shades of that same kind of cynicism now? And what do you make of the NFL's success over the last 30 years with free agency and with a whole lot more money in the system?
Well, I mean, as we established early on, it's hard to argue with the idea that the success of the NFL over the last 30 years is due in large part to the fact that there's been labor peace. I think it's hard to compare then and now to say, is the league, is it a more cynical experience now? I certainly think that, like, free agency has had an effect that's good, and it's had an effect that you kind of regret, which is that it has eroded that sense of family, that sense of commitment over a long term to each other that happens when a team can stay together. But I think that the price that players were paying to have that kind of experience was a little too high, and rightly so, that they were able to succeed and went out and get free agency, but it probably didn't have to happen this way. Ultimately, it was decided in the courts, not on the picket lines.
So we have the three teammates who are in attendance in the same row today, but I'm curious from these guys and from you, whether there's a camaraderie among this group of men who experienced this pretty extraordinary thing together 30 years ago. If you're not part of the broader Redskins family, is there another family even beyond those teams of guys that get together, guys that stay in touch, guys that share this thing?
Well, from what I observe, and I'm sure they can speak to it too, the experience, like any graduating class that has 25 years of water under the bridge, life kind of scatters you to the four winds, and you deal with life's challenges with varying levels of success. And we see that play out in the film, and they definitely have gone on to live lives of quiet dignity, and probably were looking to turn the page a little bit because, like we say, the experience was super bittersweet for them. But I think that with this film and the experience it really was the first time that they were called together. A couple years ago, we brought them all together here in Washington, and then we've had these screenings, and I think that has kind of bonded them together in a way that they didn't expect anew.
So one more question for me, and then we'll go to the audience. But the rings. Let's talk about the rings. I mean, it seemed to me, from both ends of this, we're talking about a piece of jewelry, right? I mean, you experience what you experienced. They got the money from the playoffs, but this piece of jewelry meant so much. The ownership group knows how much it means, even at the time, 30 years ago. They certainly would know today. And to a man that you interviewed, the fact that they didn't get the rings burns them right now, to this day. What is it about that symbol of the ring, that piece of hardware?
Well, certainly not. The value of the ring is not what the monetary.
They're expensive, but it's more than that.
No. It's. I think it's just symbolic of the broader experience of being a second-class citizen within your own, organization. The fact that they're not. It's a visual representation, manifestation of this thing that they've been dealing with for 30 years. So when someone asks them, "Where's your ring?" because they can see that they don't have one, then it unlocks all the other indignities that they've suffered, which is that they're not listed as official alumni. They're Anthony. And it's messy because Anthony Allen is in the record books still.
Right.
The
game's counted. Yeah.
Right. And so I think the games counted. They were promised the games would count just as much, so they should count just as much as players. If a player was played the first 3 or 4 games of the season and got injured, but they were a star player, I don't think that they would be left out from getting a ring. And the idea that they're too expensive just doesn't hold water for me, because
it does seem like there's still a
I think I know the politics of why they weren't handed out, and that would be a more honest kind of thing. We didn't want to upset the veterans at the time who were still smarting from the experience, and somehow that was a skin on the wall that they could a concession, that would appease them, the striking players. But now, in hindsight, when you look at it, when you talk about money, for 4 weeks the team wasn't paying, the going rate for NFL talent. And they were paying whatever the league minimum was, or whatever these guys were making. So the difference in the savings that the team would make over 4 games, paying that much less in game checks, I think far outstrips whatever the rings would have cost.
But it seems like there's still a piece of politics there, or at least a piece of not fully wanting to accept this as history. I was struck by Joe Gibbs, frankly. I was surprised by that. You'd expect him, given the way he embraced these players, and if off the win, you'd expect him to say, "You know what, it's been long enough. Let's make it happen."
I cut him some slack because I think he didn't have the benefit of knowing that a lot of the players who 30 years ago were pissed have now, through the passage of time, softened on the idea of the replacement players getting rings. Had he known that, he may have answered it differently, and knowing that he's not going to upset the players who were on strike. But yes, I know that it smarts even some of the replacements who I know have seen the film. That's one of the things that stands out to them that is just probably the most disappointing thing they heard in the film.
And have you seen any sign of the NFL or the Redskins, rings aside, even accepting this piece of history and adopting it more fully, even to put these guys in the roster of official players?
Well, this is kind of the bonus thing that gives this film the reason to be, sort of, is if it can be, it's the 30th anniversary of those events happening this fall. And hopefully that anniversary, in concert with the visibility of this film, will open some hearts to the idea of readdressing this.
Okay, let's get some questions out here. Do we have a mic right down here for anyone who wants to be bold and line up? Another one on this side, guys, if anyone has questions.
Yeah, I actually want to pick up on the last line of questioning. What struck me, and you kind of alluded to this, is that the regular players from the Redskins, who at the time loathed the replacement players, and they were open about that, as time went on, have kind of come to accept them and realize that, hey, they did play a part in the Super Bowl title. Given the fact that the players themselves, who would be the ones to have the most reason to be upset, have softened their attitudes, do you think that will help open the door for reconciliation, including them in the alumni events and some of the other things that you talked about?
I do. I mean, I think, you know, what's really interesting about the dynamic right now, 30 years later, is that current ownership doesn't have their hands dirty in terms of what happened 30 years ago. And it's a golden opportunity. I mean, I don't need to say that everyone knows that the organization could use some good publicity. So I think that this is like a golden opportunity that's served up to them on the plate. You know, at a minimum, to do something at like a halftime. I know that would cost them nothing, but it would be a formal recognition, welcoming these guys back into the fold, and it's something that I think I'd love to see happen.
We have time for a couple more over here.
Hi, I really enjoyed the film. Thank you so much for that, and thanks to the players for coming to this event.
Thank you.
My question is about a storyline you chose not to cover. Later in the regular season, a quarterback controversy arose because Jay Schrader was starting and was frequently relieved by Doug Williams. I always thought that the Redskins were able to hold that together with the quarterback controversy because of the unity that was formed because of the strike, because they were together when they were on strike together, and they were able to hold it together better as the season progressed. And I'm just wondering why you chose not to follow that storyline.
Well, time is one thing. I mean, we have we felt like the film doesn't overstay its welcome right now. It's like, I feel like it's, for us, you kind of always debate what's that sweet spot where a film is, you know, just the right length where it leaves people wanting more, and I think that this time we've succeeded at that more than we ever have before. But certainly I think the implication is there in the film, though we don't get into the granular details of how it manifests itself in different ways throughout the season, that the team was better off across the board throughout the season for that governing philosophy, and it played out in a million different ways. But the thing that was the cohesive about how it affected the team was that it affected the team positively when it came to team chemistry and allowed them to weather all kinds of storms, whether it's you know, fans saying we want the Scabs later in the season, or any other event that might have happened. I think, you know, they really did benefit from that kind of core philosophy of, you know, emphasizing the team, and it bore fruit in the Super Bowl.
They give us philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And one last question.
Excellent film, John. Well, I'm from Baltimore, so I don't know the history as much as most of the people here, but I do hate Dallas as well.
They make a good bad guy, I will say that, yeah.
Of the players that were kept on, did any last longer than, did any of them come back the following year and last? I really don't.
Any of the replacement players?
Correct.
Yeah, oh yes, a couple of players. So, for instance, Craig McEwen, you see in the film, he stayed around for another year with the Redskins and then played a few years in San Diego. What's interesting about him is, you know, you see the physical therapy that he's going through and what have you. I think that it leaves me wondering whether these guys, once they got a second shot, they were the least likely to raise their hand and say, take me out, I'm hurt. Because you already have had the dream taken away from you once. So I don't know, it's not a causal kind of connection, like, oh, because he was a replacement player, that's why he's more banged up than he would have been. But I would bet that your grip on the reins is that much tighter because you had the experience of losing it once, and he may be, you know, paying for that kind of, you know, commitment.
Has the broadcast date been established?
Oh yeah, thank you for asking. We were just informed Tuesday, September 12th will be the premiere on ESPN. So I just
Start of the
found that
season,
out.
around the start of the season.
Yes,
Right.
and again, this was the 30th anniversary of that season. So
kudos. Are you gonna, two fast questions, are you gonna have any kind of commercial run, and you alluded to the fact that the Washington football team needs good publicity. So you know what my question is going to be, how you feel, and maybe these wonderful players whose performances we saw tonight, how you feel, even you, Mr. Klein, about the name of the Washington football team.
Well, it's really interesting that you asked that, because when we started out making the film is 3 years at least in the making. There's a whole slew of reasons why it took that long, but when it began, it predated the kind of elevation of this issue into the consciousness of the public. Myself included. I think I am like most people who I didn't even think about it. Right? I didn't even think about it. And then when I was confronted with the pain that it might cause certain people, I was kind of like, well, I don't want to contribute to that, right? So I tried to make every effort. I think at ESPN as well, made a collective decision to try, in the editorial, in the presence of filmmaking, like when you see the lower thirds or whatever, that we would avoid putting the word in front of people's face, just to, not play a part in it and be neutral about it, because I think it's the story. What we don't want is for the story, this great story and these great accomplishments of these guys, to be brought down into that debate. And so we did everything we could to allow the story to stand on its own.
Well, it was a debate that was different in 1987 than it is in 2017.
Correct.
I mean, it wasn't the same thing around it.
Not at all. No. I mean, in 2011, it wasn't the same. So we just, didn't want to compound the problem by, mentioning the word too much in VO or using it on screen in text, and felt like we threaded the needle just right to allow the story to shine and stand up on its own right.
Well, John Dorsey, thank you again, and congratulations on this terrific film.
Thank you.